He's a Niki Lauda, Formula One driving.
Impossible.
Across to the left, Lauda. But it's Lauda who takes it. Crosses the line. Now he
1970, a young British driver named James Hunt pulls up to a Formula 3 race weekend with his girlfriend, eager to turn heads and climb closer to Formula 1. He walks her through the paddock, introducing her to his crew and their eccentric team owner, Lord Hesketh, before proudly unveiling his car like it's a prized possession. But just moments later, the bravado cracks. James leans over and vomits. It's not panic, it's routine, something that happens before every race. He wipes his mouth, steadies himself, and slips into his ritual, champagne for calm, a cigarette to settle the nerves, then lowers himself into the cockpit. As engines begin to roar, his attention locks onto another driver across the grid, a newcomer, quiet, focused, Austrian, Niki Lauda. The race kicks off with an explosion of sound. Engines scream so loudly that James' girlfriend covers her ears, overwhelmed by the chaos. Out on the track, Hunt and Lauda waste no time pushing forward, slicing through the field until they're battling at the front. Lap after lap, neither gives an inch. On the final stretch, Lauda executes a calculated move and edges ahead, but James refuses to back down. He lunges with a bold, almost reckless maneuver, and it backfires. Their cars collide. Lauda is forced out instantly, his race finished. Hunt somehow keeps going and storms across the finish line to take the win. It's a victory, but not a clean one. Lauder is furious, confronting Hunt and accusing him of driving without discipline. James and his crew brush it off, laughing at him, dismissing him as overly cautious. To them, he's nothing more than a stiff, overly serious outsider. But Lauder's story runs deeper. Raised in a wealthy Austrian family tied to business and politics, Nicky defied expectations by choosing racing over a traditional career. His decision didn't sit well with his father, who cut him off financially. Left to fend for himself, Lauda secured a bank loan and used it to buy his way into a struggling Formula One team, betting everything on his ability. Meanwhile, James Hunt's life seems to be moving in the opposite direction. Now with a new girlfriend on his arm, he's crowned Britain's Driver of the Year. Confident and charismatic, he delivers a swagger-filled speech that only reinforces his growing reputation. But reality hits fast. The rival he mocked, the same man he called a coward, has already made it to Formula One. Niki Lauda didn't need to win that race. He paid his way in, investing 2 million shillings for a seat. He's already stepped onto the biggest stage in motorsport. Lauda arrives in France for pre-season testing, stepping into an environment that's far from glamorous. He meets his teammate, Clay Rigazzoni, along with the mechanics responsible for keeping the cars alive. When he inspects his assigned vehicle, he's unimpressed. The machine weighs 600 kilograms, with nearly a third of that mass coming from the engine alone. To Lauda, that's unacceptable. Without hesitation, he begins pointing out flaws, breaking down exactly what needs to change. His technical understanding catches everyone off guard. He's not just a driver, he's an engineer in disguise. He instructs the team with precision, outlining improvements with confidence. Once the adjustments are made, Rigazzoni takes the car out for a test run. The result, he's 2.5 seconds faster than before. That changes everything. Recognizing Lauda's value, the team offers him a serious deal. In exchange for his ongoing technical input and his financial backing, he secures a 3-year contract, earning equal status alongside their lead driver. Later, as Lauda prepares to meet the team manager for a date, Rigazzoni pulls him aside with a smirk and a warning. The woman he's about to see once had a thing for someone else. Not just anyone, James Hunt. Elsewhere in Europe, Hunt receives his own breakthrough news. He's officially entered Formula One, but the excitement is quickly overshadowed during a qualifying session when tragedy strikes. A driver crashes at high speed, and the impact is so violent it kills him instantly. This is the reality of the sport. James is visibly shaken. The danger feels closer now, more real than ever before. But Lauda, he sees it differently, cold, logical. To him, it's simple. A mistake was made and the consequences followed. Back in the garage, Hunt tries to focus, mentally rehearsing an upcoming circuit, visualizing every corner, every braking point. That's when Susie Miller walks in, a striking model and notably Lord Hesketh's girlfriend. There's an instant spark between them, something electric and undeniable. It doesn't take long for that spark to turn into something serious. Soon enough, headlines explode across tabloids. The rebellious, hard-living racer has tied the knot with a rising star, but the celebration doesn't last. News breaks that Lauda has signed with Ferrari, the most iconic team in Formula One. The decision was heavily influenced by Rigazzoni, who vouched for Lauda's technical brilliance. At a press conference, Enzo Ferrari himself introduces the Austrian as the future of the team. Behind closed doors, Lauda opens up in a rare moment of honesty. He admits that if he had any other skill, anything else he could rely on, he wouldn't choose a life that puts him at risk every time he gets behind the wheel. But this is all he has. This is what he's good at. Rigazzoni later invites him out to socialize, to meet friends and enjoy a night away from racing. But Lauda's blunt nature and lack of charm don't help him fit in. He's awkward, direct, and completely uninterested in playing along. Eventually, he's left outside, excluded. Standing alone, he's offered a ride by a woman passing by. She's unimpressed from the start, clearly not taken by his personality. But once they're driving, Lauda starts commenting on the car, identifying issues purely from the sounds it makes. He points out warped brakes. She laughs, brushing it off as nonsense. But then, exactly as he predicted, the car fails. Now stranded, she steps out to flag down help. Moments later, a group of Italian men screeches to a halt, but not for her. They've recognized Lauda. The woman, Marlene, is caught off guard. This is a Formula One driver. He doesn't look the part. He's not particularly attractive, not charismatic, not even stylish. And the way he drives, careful. Almost dull, Lauda doesn't care about any of that. He tells her something simple, almost blunt. Risking your life only makes sense if there's a clear reason to win. Something about that statement lingers. On impulse, Marlene challenges him. If he believes that so strongly, then maybe it's time he shows exactly what he's capable of. He takes her up on the challenge without hesitation. And somewhere along the winding roads, with the engine howling and the car dancing through every corner, something shifts. What begins as doubt slowly turns into admiration. By the time the drive ends, she sees him differently, and just like that, he's won her over. The story moves ahead to the 1975 United States Grand Prix. Once again, it's the same rivalry at the center, Lara versus Hunt, two completely different men, now fighting for the same prize. From the sidelines, their partners watch closely, tracking every move, every split second that could decide everything. As the race approaches its final moments, Hunt's car begins to falter. Mechanical issues creep in, forcing him to ease off the pace. Lara seizes the opportunity without hesitation, pushing ahead and taking control. He crosses the finish line first, securing not just the race, but the world championship itself. Back in the paddock, Hunt shrugs it off, refusing to give Lara the credit. In his eyes, it wasn't talent that won the title, it was the machine. Ferrari had the fastest car, and that's what made the difference. But away from the noise of competition, the contrast between the two drivers becomes even more striking. Hunt thrives in the spotlight. He's magnetic, loud, and constantly surrounded by people. Parties, alcohol, chaos, that's where he feels alive. His lifestyle is as wild as his driving. Lara, on the other hand, exists in a completely different world. He's precise, controlled, and emotionally distant. Routine defines him. He keeps others at a distance, often blunt to the point of being offensive. Where Hunt embraces disorder, Lara eliminates it. Then everything changes for Hunt. Lord Hesketh can no longer keep the team alive. Formula One has drained his wealth and the operation collapses. Just like that, Hunt is left without a seat, no car, no contract, no future in the sport. Teams hesitate, sponsors pull back. His reputation, once exciting, now feels like a liability. As opportunities disappear, so does his focus. Drinking replaces discipline. His relationship with Susie begins to fracture under constant tension. Arguments become routine. The pressure builds and the cracks in his personal life grow impossible to ignore. And then an opportunity appears. McLaren is searching for a new driver. Hunt is on their shortlist, but so is another option. A seasoned veteran, steady and reliable, not flashy but dependable. Hunt knows what's at stake. He pleads for the chance, promising to change. He assures them he'll follow orders, stay disciplined, but most importantly, he guarantees one thing. He'll beat Niki Lauda, that's what seals it. He gets the seat. The new season begins under the scorching heat of Brazil. Lauda dominates from the start, while Hunt's race ends prematurely due to engine failure. In South Africa, Lauda wins again, with Hunt trailing behind in second place. Then comes Spain. This time Hunt finally breaks through, crossing the finish line first. A long-awaited victory, but it doesn't last. Lauda challenges the result behind the scenes, pointing out a technical violation. Hunt's car is slightly too wide, by just 1.5 centimeters. It's enough. He's disqualified. Monaco brings even more frustration. Hunt's car struggles again, overheating and becoming nearly impossible to handle after adjustments. While Lauda continues collecting points, Hunt is left watching, powerless, as his season slips further away. The frustration boils over. Hunt lashes out, calling Lauda a rat, but Lauda doesn't respond with anger. He responds with precision. He brings up something far more personal. Rumors about Susie are already spreading. Lauda makes sure Hunt hears them. The media had picked it up first. Whispers had turned into headlines. Everyone seemed to know except him. Behind closed doors, Hunt confronts Susie. Their conversation is quiet but heavy with emotion. The damage is undeniable. Outside, he maintains his image, brushing off questions with charm and deflection. But internally something shifts, something breaks. At the next race, Hunt returns as a different man, sharper, focused, controlled. The car is improved, and so is he. This time he wins. Back in England, racing on home soil, he delivers again. Another victory. The crowd erupts, fully behind him. Then comes a turning point. After months of review, the earlier disqualification in Spain is overturned. The points are reinstated. Suddenly, Hunt's season is alive again. In a matter of weeks, he's gone from being written off to becoming the most talked-about driver in the sport. But despite the momentum, Lauda still leads the standings. Meanwhile, Lauda's personal life quietly evolves. Away from the spotlight, he marries Marlene. No spectacle, no headlines, just a simple, private moment. During their honeymoon, he reveals something deeply personal. Happiness unsettles him. It introduces risk, not on the track, but in life. For the first time, he has something to lose. Then comes Germany, the Nürburgring. A track infamous for its danger, its history written in accidents and tragedy. Even before the race begins, tension fills the air. During qualifying, a serious crash reminds everyone just how unforgiving this circuit is. At one point, a fan approaches Lauda for an autograph and casually asks him to include the date, just in case it becomes his last race. The message is clear. This place is deadly. To make matters worse, relentless rain lashes the circuit. Conditions become nearly unmanageable. Lara calls for a meeting with the other drivers. He argues that the race should be cancelled. It's simply too dangerous, but many disagree. Led by Hunt, they accuse him of trying to manipulate the situation. If the race is called off, Lara's lead in the championship remains untouched. To them, it feels strategic, not cautious. The vote goes against him. The race will continue. By race day, the rain has eased slightly, but the track remains treacherous. Most drivers, including Lara and Hunt, opt for wet tires. The race begins. Lara takes the early lead, pushing ahead with confidence. But by the end of the first lap, a daring move from a McLaren driver on slick tires changes everything. Parts of the track are already drying, and the gamble starts to pay off. Drivers begin diving into the pits, switching to dry tires one by one. Lara follows, but his stop goes wrong. A delay costs him precious seconds. Hunt surges ahead. Lara pushes harder, chasing him down, refusing to back off. And then it happens. As he accelerates, something gives way. The rear suspension fails. Instantly, the car loses control, spinning violently off the track before slamming into the barrier. Flames erupt. Within seconds, another car crashes into him at full speed. The wreckage burns. For a moment, everything stands still. Then, drivers rush in, risking their own lives as they pull him from the inferno. But the damage is catastrophic. Niki Lauda has been dragged out of a nightmare, one that nearly claimed his life. The crash leaves Lauda gravely injured. His face and scalp are severely burned, and the intense heat he inhaled has damaged his lungs. Technically, Hunt takes the victory at the German Grand Prix, but there's no joy in it. Not this time. Winning means nothing when his rival is fighting for his life. Doctors aren't even sure Lauda will survive the night. But when he finally regains consciousness, his first reaction says everything about him. A priest stands by his bedside, and Lauda, barely able to speak, tells him to leave, blunt, defiant, still himself. Marlene comes to see him, but the man lying there is almost unrecognizable. The injuries have changed him physically, and the recovery is brutal. Every day is filled with unbearable pain, especially when the bandages are removed and replaced. It's a constant reminder of how close he came to dying. One afternoon, while he lies there in agony, a race plays on the television, the Austrian Grand Prix. Time doesn't stop. The season moves forward without him. Weeks pass. By the fifth week, Hunt secures another victory, this time in the Netherlands. Meanwhile, Lauda's condition remains fragile. At one point, fluid builds up in his lungs again. The doctors hesitate to perform the painful procedure needed to drain it, but Lauda refuses to wait. He insists they do it immediately, no matter how much it hurts. There's no time for hesitation. The championship is slipping further away with every passing race. His recovery becomes a race of its own. Soon, he's attempting something almost unthinkable, forcing a helmet onto his still-healing head. The damaged skin tears under pressure. The pain is overwhelming, but he doesn't stop. And then, just 42 days after the accident, Lauda walks back into the paddock, the Italian Grand Prix. Even Hunt is stunned when he sees him. The scars are visible, raw and permanent, but there's something unchanged, the intensity in his eyes. That same determination is still there. Lauda looks directly at Hunt and tells him something unexpected. In a strange way, he blames him, but also credits him. It was their rivalry that pushed him back here. It nearly killed him, yet it's also the reason he returned. At the press conference, he tries to lighten the mood with dark humor. Skin grafted from his leg now covers part of his head. He jokes that at least he won't sweat anymore, something that might actually help in a race car. For a moment, there's laughter. Then a reporter crosses the line, asking if he fears his wife might leave him because of his appearance. The room goes silent. Lauda ends the conference immediately. Later, Hunt tracks down the journalist in a restroom and beats him severely, his own way of responding to the insult. Back on the track, Lauda's return is anything but easy. Every bump sends shockwaves of pain through his skull. His vision struggles to stay clear. At the start, he falls behind, unable to keep pace. Then suddenly a crash ahead forces him to refocus. Something shifts. The pain fades into the background. His mind locks in. Slowly, he starts to regain rhythm, pushing harder, climbing positions one by one. Even the driver Ferrari brought in as his replacement becomes just another obstacle to overcome. Hunt, meanwhile, doesn't finish the race. After everything, Lauda manages to secure fourth place. It's not a win, but it feels like one. As he steps out of the car, the crowd surges toward him, ignoring the actual race winner. They're cheering for the man who came back from the brink of death. For a moment, the championship still seems within reach, but Hunt isn't done. He responds with consecutive victories, rapidly closing the gap. What once seemed certain now becomes a fight again. Everything comes down to the final race, the Japanese Grand Prix at Fuji. Only 3 points separate them. The conditions are terrible. A typhoon batters the track, rain pours relentlessly, and thick fog hangs low over the circuit. Even Hunt, haunted by the memory of Germany, suggests the race should be cancelled. The organizers refuse. Drivers drill small holes into their visors just to keep them from fogging up. Visibility is almost non-existent. Before the race begins, beneath the shadow of Mount Fuji, Hunt and Lara exchange a brief glance. No words, just acknowledgement. The lights go out. The race begins. Hunt takes the lead early, pushing hard despite the conditions. Lara follows, but the spray from the cars ahead makes it nearly impossible to see. Water floods his visor. The track disappears into a blur. Breathing becomes difficult, and then his focus shifts not to the race but to something else. He thinks of Marlene. In that moment, clarity replaces ambition. At the end of the second lap, Lara pulls into the pit lane. There's nothing wrong with the car, no mechanical failure. He simply climbs out, removes his helmet, and walks away. He's made his decision. There's nothing left to prove, not if it means risking his life again. Now everything rests on Hunt. To claim the championship, he needs to finish at least third. Lap after lap, he pushes forward. On lap 58, he's still leading, but his tires are deteriorating. By lap 70, he's forced to pit. When he returns to the track, he's dropped to 6th place. The title begins to slip away. His team urges caution. Just finish, stay safe. But Hunt doesn't know how to settle. He attacks, one overtake, then another. Each lap becomes a battle. Slowly, he climbs back through the field until only one driver stands between him and the position he needs. He goes for it and makes it stick. Hunt crosses the finish line in 3rd place. It's enough. By a single point, James Hunt becomes the Formula One world champion. From the sidelines, Lara watches quietly. There's no bitterness in his expression. He tells Marlene he has no regrets. Hunt, meanwhile, is swept into a whirlwind of fame. Interviews, endorsements, magazine covers. His life becomes even more chaotic. The celebrations never seem to end. Months later, the two rivals meet again in Italy. Lara, ever disciplined, has shifted his focus to flying, training with the same intensity he brought to racing. Hunt, unchanged, admits he has no intention of preparing for the next season. He simply wants to enjoy life. That contrast never fades. Hunt never cared about the critics who claimed his title came only because Lara crashed. In his mind, he earned it the only way that mattered, by risking everything. Over time, both men come to understand the truth. They made each other better. For Hunt, one championship was enough. Just 2 years later, he walked away from racing entirely. When they crossed paths again years later, Lara had returned to the top, claiming another championship. Hunt had become a television commentator, still charismatic, still unpredictable, living life exactly the way he always had. Until one day, that life came to an abrupt end. At just 45 years old, James Hunt suffered a fatal heart attack. Lara would later reflect on their rivalry, admitting something rare. Hunt was one of the very few people he truly respected, and the only one he ever envied. And with that, their story reaches its end. What Rush does almost immediately is flip your expectations. You walk into it thinking you're about to watch a racing movie. Speed, engines, competition, the kind of film where the track is everything and the drivers are just extensions of the machines. That's what decades of racing cinema have conditioned us to expect. The spectacle comes first, the people come second, but Rush quietly rejects that formula, because this isn't a film about racing. It's a film about the kind of people who choose to race, and that difference changes everything. The cars are still there, of course. The tracks, the overtakes, the crashes, they all exist, but they're not the centerpiece. They're not the reason the story moves forward. Instead, they function like pressure points, moments where everything inside these characters, fear, ego, obsession, gets forced to the surface. The real engine of the film isn't mechanical. It's psychological. What makes Rush compelling is how it treats racing not as the subject, but as the environment, a stage, a battleground, a place where two completely different personalities are pushed to their limits. The speed is just the catalyst. The danger is just the amplifier. What actually matters is what's happening beneath the helmet, and that's why the film feels so different from traditional racing movies. Older films in the genre often leaned into immersion, long stretches of driving, technical precision, the sensation of being inside the race itself. You were meant to experience the sport. Rush takes a step back from that approach. It's not trying to simulate racing for you. It's trying to make you understand the mindset of someone who would risk everything to win. Why would someone willingly step into a machine where one mistake could cost them their life? Why would they keep coming back again and again, knowing exactly what's at stake? That's the question the film is really asking. And the answer isn't found in the races, it's found in the people. Because once you strip away the speed, what you're left with is something far more intense, two men driven by completely different philosophies, yet chasing the same goal. One thrives on chaos, the other survives through control. One races for the thrill, the other races to master it. The track doesn't define them, it reveals them, and that's why the racing almost feels secondary, not unimportant, but reframed. Every race becomes less about who's ahead on the track and more about what it means for them psychologically, what it costs them, what it proves. Even the most intense sequences aren't just about action, they're about consequence. Every turn carries risk, every decision exposes character. So when the film slows down, and it does, it's not losing momentum, it's shifting focus. It's reminding you that the real story isn't happening at 200 miles per hour. It's happening in the silence before the race, in the fear no one admits, in the choices that define who these men are when everything is on the line. That's what elevates Rush. It takes a genre built on motion and finds its power in stillness. It takes a story about machines and makes it entirely human. And by doing that, it transforms what could have been just another racing movie into something far more compelling, a character study disguised as a sports film, where the real finish line isn't the track, it's understanding what drives these men in the first place. One of the most surprising things about Rush is who it's actually for, because on paper this shouldn't work. A film about Formula One, set in the 1970s, focused on real drivers, real races, real events. If you're not already invested in that world, if you don't know the names, the tracks, the history, there's every reason to feel like this just isn't your kind of movie. And yet, it pulls you in anyway. That's the quiet strength of Rush. Because it doesn't expect you to care about racing. It makes you care about the people who do. You don't need to understand lap times, tire strategies, or mechanical setups. The film doesn't demand technical knowledge from you. It doesn't overwhelm you with jargon or insider detail. Instead, it translates everything into something universal: competition, ego, fear, ambition. It speaks in emotions, not mechanics. So even if you've never watched a single race in your life, you still understand what's at stake. You understand what it feels like to want something so badly that you're willing to risk everything for it. You understand the pressure of being compared to someone better, or at least someone you believe is better. You understand the frustration, the pride, the desperation to prove yourself. And suddenly, it doesn't matter that it's Formula One. It could be anything, because the core conflict is human. That's why the film works for people who would normally avoid this genre entirely. It doesn't trap itself inside the sport. It uses the sport as a backdrop for something much more relatable. The races become expressions of character, not just displays of skill. Even the way the film handles its pacing reflects this. The racing sequences are intense, but they're not overwhelming. They're not stretched out endlessly. They're sharp, focused, and purposeful, just enough to give you the adrenaline without losing you in the details. And outside of those moments, the film slows down just enough for you to connect, to understand who these people are, to see what drives them, to feel what they're risking. That balance is what makes Rush accessible. It never talks down to you, but it also never assumes you're an expert. It meets you where you are, and then gradually pulls you deeper into the experience without you even noticing it. By the time the story reaches its most intense moments, you're no longer watching a racing movie. You're watching two people push themselves to the edge, and you care. That's the key. Because accessibility isn't about simplifying the subject. It's about translating it into something meaningful, and Rush does that effortlessly. It takes a niche world and turns it into a universal story. So even if you don't care about racing, by the end of it, you'll care about everything that happens on that track. There's something fascinating about the way Rush is directed, because it sits right on the edge between precision and restraint. On one hand, this is a film that feels incredibly polished. Every scene is clean, every transition is controlled, the pacing rarely collapses. There's a sense that everything is exactly where it's supposed to be. Nothing feels accidental. Nothing feels messy, and that's classic Ron Howard. He's a director who understands structure. He knows how to guide an audience, how to shape a story so it remains accessible, engaging, and easy to follow, even when the subject itself could become overwhelming. In Rush, that control is everywhere. The narrative never spirals out of focus. The rivalry remains clear. The emotional beats land exactly when they're supposed to. But that same strength is also where the tension lies. Because for all its polish, Rush sometimes feels like it's holding back. It doesn't take wild risks. It doesn't push into uncomfortable ambiguity. It doesn't fully surrender to chaos, the very thing that defines the world it's portraying. Instead, it keeps everything just within reach, just within control, and that creates an interesting contrast. You're watching a story about men who live on the edge, who make decisions that could kill them, who thrive in unpredictability, and yet the film itself is carefully composed, almost cautious in how it presents that world. It's like watching danger through a perfectly framed lens. Now, to be fair, that approach works more often than it doesn't. because what Howard achieves here is clarity. He takes a complex, real-life rivalry and presents it in a way that anyone can follow. He avoids drowning the audience in technical detail. He keeps the focus where it matters, on the characters, on the emotional stakes, on the human side of the story. And in doing so, he makes the film widely accessible. But at the same time, you can't help but wonder what it would feel like if the film leaned a little further into risk, if it allowed scenes to breathe longer, if it embraced discomfort instead of smoothing it out, if it trusted the audience to sit with ambiguity instead of guiding them through it, because there are moments, brief flashes, where you see what that version of the film could have been. Moments where the tension spikes, where the filmmaking becomes more aggressive, more immersive, more daring. And in those moments, you realize just how powerful this story could be if it fully broke free from its restraint. But Rush never quite goes there. It chooses control over chaos, precision over unpredictability, craft over experimentation, and that's not necessarily a flaw. In fact, it's the reason the film works for such a wide audience. It's the reason the story feels cohesive, the reason the performances shine, the reason the narrative never loses its footing. But it's also the reason it stops just short of something greater. Because in a story about men who risk everything, the filmmaking itself rarely does. And that's the paradox of Rush, a film directed with confidence, clarity, and undeniable skill, but one that occasionally feels like it's playing just a little too safe when it had every opportunity not to. At the heart of Rush, beneath the speed, beneath the spectacle, there's one thing that drives everything forward, a rivalry that feels less like competition and more like inevitability. This isn't just about two drivers trying to win a championship. It's about two men who shouldn't exist in the same world, yet somehow define each other because they do. On one side, you have James Hunt, all instinct, all chaos. A man who races like he lives, fast, reckless, unapologetically indulgent. He doesn't calculate risk, he challenges it. He doesn't prepare for control, he thrives in the absence of it. And then there's Lara, precision, discipline. Control, where Hunt embraces unpredictability, Lara eliminates it. Every move is measured. Every decision is calculated. He doesn't rely on emotion, he outthinks it. For him, racing isn't about thrill, it's about perfection. And that's what makes this rivalry so compelling, because it's not just about who's faster, it's about which philosophy survives. Every time they step onto the track, it's not just a race, it's a clash of ideologies, chaos versus control, instinct versus intellect, freedom versus discipline, and neither side is completely right. That's the brilliance of it. The film doesn't frame this as good versus bad, it doesn't push you to choose a side. Instead, it forces you to sit in the tension between them, to recognize that both men are flawed, both are driven, and both are necessary for the other to truly exist. Because without Lara, Hunt is just reckless. Without Hunt, Lara is just mechanical. They don't just compete with each other, they complete each other. And that's where the rivalry becomes something deeper. It evolves. What begins as opposition slowly transforms into something more complex, something unspoken. A recognition, a respect that neither of them would ever openly admit, but both understand on a level no one else can reach, because no one else is pushing them like this. No one else is forcing them to confront their limits. No one else is revealing who they really are. That's what makes their rivalry feel alive. It's not built on hatred, it's built on necessity. Each man needs the other, not to win, but to become. And the closer they get to the edge, the more that truth becomes impossible to ignore. Because in the end, Rush isn't asking who wins. It's asking something far more interesting. What happens when your greatest rival is the only person who truly understands you? That's not just competition. That's something closer to identity. And that's why the rivalry between Hunt and Lara doesn't just drive the film, it is the film. Most films like this make a choice. They pick one hero and build the entire story around that perspective. One journey, one emotional anchor, one lens through which everything is experienced. Rush refuses to do that. Instead, it splits itself in two. This is not a story told about one man. It's a story told between two. From the very beginning, the film makes it clear that both James Hunt and Lara are equally important. Not as supporting forces, not as obstacles to each other, but as parallel centers of gravity. The narrative doesn't orbit one and pass through the other. It moves back and forth, constantly shifting alignment, constantly recalibrating your perspective. And that choice changes how you experience everything, because you're never fully settled. You're not guided toward a single emotional allegiance. One moment, you're inside Hunt's world, feeling his freedom, his impulsiveness, his hunger for life. The next, you're pulled into Lara's mindset, his control, his discipline, his relentless pursuit of perfection. The film doesn't tell you who to root for. It asks you to understand both. And that's where the dual protagonist structure becomes powerful. Instead of simplifying the rivalry, it complicates it. every victory feels incomplete because you've just seen what it cost the other side. Every failure carries weight because you understand what was at stake from both perspectives. The film doesn't allow clean emotional wins. It constantly reminds you that every triumph comes with a counterpoint. That's not easy storytelling. Because when you divide your focus, you risk losing depth, you risk creating distance, you risk turning both characters into fragments instead of fully realized individuals, and at times, Rush walks right up to that edge. There are moments where you can feel the limitation of this approach, where the story moves forward, but doesn't quite linger long enough inside either character to fully explore what's beneath the surface. Moments where you wonder what it would feel like if the film committed entirely to one perspective and let that journey unfold without interruption. But then, it pulls you back. Because what you gain from this structure is something you wouldn't get otherwise. Balance, perspective, contrast. You're not just watching a rivalry, you're experiencing it from both sides simultaneously. You see the cause and effect, the push and the response, the action and the consequence. The film becomes less about a single arc and more about an ongoing exchange, two lives colliding, influencing, reshaping each other in real time. And that's where the storytelling becomes something more than conventional, because instead of asking, who is the hero, it asks, what happens when both of them are? That question reshapes the entire narrative. It removes the simplicity of good versus bad. It replaces it with something more human, two flawed individuals, both chasing greatness, both paying the price for it, both deserving of understanding even when they're at odds. The dual protagonist approach doesn't just tell the story, it defines it, because in a rivalry like this, there isn't one side that matters more. There are only two sides and the space between them. And that space, that tension, that constant shift, that refusal to settle, is where Rush finds its identity. There's a certain rhythm to Rush, and once you notice it, you realize the entire film is built around it, not just speed. Momentum, because this isn't a story that moves in a straight line. It accelerates, it pulls back, it surges forward again, almost like a race itself. From the very beginning, the film wastes no time dropping you into the world of James Hunt and Niki Lauda. There's no heavy exposition, no long setup phase. It trusts you to catch up as it moves, and that gives the opening a kind of immediacy, a sense that things are already in motion before you even arrive, and that's intentional. Because Rush doesn't want to feel like a biography being explained. It wants to feel like a story already unfolding. As the film progresses, the pacing finds its groove in the back and forth between its two central figures. It shifts perspectives, builds tension through contrast, and keeps the narrative moving without getting trapped in one place for too long. There's always a sense of forward motion, of something building, even in the quieter moments. But here's where it gets interesting, because the film doesn't maintain one consistent speed. It changes gears. The early stretch feels measured, almost observational. It's introducing personalities, establishing dynamics, laying the groundwork. Then, as the rivalry intensifies, the pacing tightens. Scenes become sharper, transitions quicker, the sense of urgency more pronounced. And then comes the shift, the moment that redefines everything. After Lauda's crash, the film doesn't just continue at the same pace, it recalibrates. It slows down just enough to let the weight of what's happened sink in. The rhythm becomes heavier, more deliberate. You're no longer just watching competition, you're watching consequence, and that shift works because it gives the story emotional gravity. It allows the film to breathe when it needs to sit in discomfort, to let the stakes feel real rather than just exciting. But at the same time, this is where the pacing becomes a point of debate. Because while most of the film feels controlled and purposeful, the final stretch moves differently, faster, almost too fast. The climax, what should feel like the full release of everything the film has been building toward, arrives with intensity, but not always with the space it deserves. Events unfold quickly. Resolutions come sooner than expected. And for some, it feels like the story is racing to the finish line instead of fully living in its final moments. It's a strange contradiction. A film about control that, in its last act, feels slightly rushed. And yet, even that has a kind of thematic consistency, because Rush has always been about momentum, about movement, about lives that don't slow down, even when they probably should. So while the pacing isn't flawless, it is purposeful. It mirrors the world it's portraying, fast when it needs to be, measured when it matters, and occasionally pushing forward just a little too quickly, but maybe that's the point, because in a story like this, nothing ever truly slows down. It just keeps moving until someone crosses the line. What gives Rush its pulse isn't just speed, it's contrast, because at the center of this story aren't just two rivals, but two completely different ways of living. On one side you have James Hunt, unpredictable, impulsive, driven by instinct. He doesn't calculate outcomes, he reacts to them. He lives in the moment, races in the moment, and thrives on the chaos that most people would run from. For him, danger isn't something to avoid, it's something to feel. Then there's Niki Lauda, controlled, precise, analytical. Where Hunt embraces uncertainty, Lauda eliminates it. Every move is planned, every variable is studied. He doesn't trust emotion, he overrides it. Racing, for him, isn't about adrenaline, it's about mastery, and that difference isn't just surface level, it's philosophical. Hunt believes in experience, Lauda believes in preparation. Hunt pushes forward because he wants to feel alive. Lauda pushes forward because he refuses to lose control. One is driven by instinct, the other is driven by intellect. And what makes Rush so compelling is that it never tells you which one is right, because both of them work, and both of them fail. That's the tension. You see Hunt's freedom, his charisma, his ability to embrace risk, and you understand why that makes him dangerous. But you also see the cracks, the lack of discipline, the self-destruction lurking beneath the surface. Then you see Lauda's discipline, his intelligence, his precision, and you understand why that makes him formidable. But you also see the cost, the isolation, the emotional distance, the relentless pressure he puts on himself. Neither path is perfect, neither path is safe, and yet both lead to the same place. The edge, that's what connects them. Because despite everything that separates them, they are chasing the exact same thing, control over something that can never truly be controlled. Speed, risk, fate. And the closer they get to that edge, the more their differences start to blur. Because at that level, instinct and calculation begin to overlap. Emotion and logic stop being opposites and start becoming tools. Survival demands both. That's when the rivalry becomes something deeper. Not just a clash of personalities, but a collision of philosophies. A question without a clear answer. Is it better to feel everything or control everything? Rush doesn't resolve that question. It lets both men answer it in their own way. And in doing so, it reveals something more powerful than either approach on its own. That greatness doesn't come from choosing one path. It comes from pushing that path as far as it can possibly go. What Rush is really asking isn't who wins. It's why they're willing to risk everything just to find out. Because beneath the races, beneath the rivalry, beneath the spectacle, this is a film about risk, ego, and purpose. Three forces that don't just drive the story, they drive the people inside it. Look at James Hunt. For him, risk isn't a consequence. It's the point. There's something almost addictive in the way he approaches danger. The closer he gets to losing control, the more alive he feels. It's not just about winning, it's about experiencing something most people are too afraid to even approach. He doesn't run from the edge, he chases it. Because for Hunt, purpose isn't found in safety, it's found in intensity. Now contrast that with Niki Lauda. He doesn't seek risk, he manages it. Every decision he makes is about reducing uncertainty, about turning chaos into something predictable. Where Hunt embraces the unknown, Lauda tries to eliminate it. He believes control is the only way to survive and the only way to win. But here's the paradox. Both men are chasing the same thing, meaning, identity. A reason to exist at the level they're operating. And that's where ego comes in. Not ego in the shallow sense, not arrogance, not vanity, but something deeper. The need to define yourself, to prove that you are who you believe you are. For Hunt, ego says, I am the best because I feel it. For Lauda, ego says, I am the best because I've calculated it. Two completely different foundations, leading to the same obsession, and the film never judges either of them. It doesn't say one is right and the other is wrong, because both philosophies carry a cost. Hunt's path is exhilarating, but unstable. It burns fast, consumes everything, and leaves little behind once it's over. Lauda's path is controlled, but isolating. It demands discipline, sacrifice, and a level of emotional detachment that slowly separates him from everything else. Different methods, same sacrifice. And then the film pushes both of them to their breaking point, because when risk becomes real, when it stops being abstract and becomes physical, painful, unavoidable, everything changes. Suddenly, the philosophy is no longer theoretical. It's survival. What do you do when the thing that defines you almost destroys you? Do you walk away, or do you go back? That's where Rush becomes more than a story about racing. It becomes a question. What is your purpose if it requires you to risk your life to fulfill it? And more importantly, is that purpose worth it? The film doesn't answer that directly. Instead, it shows you two different responses. One man who keeps chasing the feeling. Another who recalculates the cost. Both still driven, both still defined by it. Because in the end, Rush understands something most films don't. At the highest level, greatness isn't just about talent. It's about what you're willing to sacrifice to prove it. And whether, when everything is on the line, you still believe it's worth the risk. What Rush does brilliantly is show you that the race doesn't end when the drivers step out of the car. It just changes form, because who these men are on the track is exactly who they are off it. There's no separation, no switch, no second identity. Look at James Hunt. The way he drives, reckless, instinctive, unpredictable, that's not something he turns on for racing. That's who he is. His personal life mirrors that same energy. Fast decisions, impulsive relationships, a constant chase for stimulation. He doesn't just seek thrill behind the wheel, he builds his entire life around it. Everything is immediate, everything is intense, everything burns quickly, and at first that looks like freedom. But the film slowly reveals the cost of living like that. The same impulsiveness that makes him dangerous on the track begins to fracture his personal life. Relationships collapse, stability disappears. The very traits that fuel his success start working against him when there's no finish line to cross. Then there's Niki Lauda, completely different rhythm. Where Hunt moves on instinct, Lauda moves with intention. His personal life reflects the same discipline he brings to racing. He doesn't rush into decisions. He builds them. He studies them. Even his relationships feel structured, grounded, deliberate. There's a sense of control, a sense of order. But that control comes at a cost too, because the same emotional restraint that makes him effective on the track creates distance off it. He doesn't connect easily. He doesn't express easily. His world is efficient, but not always warm. And that's what makes this contrast so powerful, because the film isn't just showing you two different drivers, it's showing you two different ways of living, one driven by feeling, one driven by control. And both approaches bleed into everything: their careers, their relationships, their decisions, their mistakes. There's no version of them that exists outside of who they are at their core. That's why the personal moments in Rush matter so much. They're not distractions from the main story, they are the main story. Because every argument, every relationship breakdown, every quiet moment, it all reflects the same internal wiring that defines how they race. The track doesn't create these men, it exposes them. And what's fascinating is that neither approach guarantees fulfillment. Hunt's freedom leads to chaos. Lauda's control leads to isolation. Different paths, same question. What does it actually mean to live a balanced life when everything you are is built around winning? Rush doesn't answer that. It just shows you the reality, that the same qualities that make someone exceptional in their profession can make everything else in their life infinitely more complicated. Because in the end, they're not just racing against each other. They're living exactly the way they drive. And that's a race you can't ever step out of. At first glance, what you see in Rush feels simple: two men, one goal. A rivalry built on competition. But the deeper you go, the more that rivalry begins to change shape. Because this isn't just about conflict, it's about connection. At the center of it are James Hunt and Niki Lauda, two men who, on the surface, couldn't be more different. Different personalities, different philosophies, different ways of living. And yet, they understand each other in a way no one else can. That's where the film becomes something more than a competition story. Because what begins as rivalry slowly evolves into respect. Not the kind of respect that's spoken out loud, not the kind that's expressed through friendship, but something quieter, something harder: recognition. They see each other clearly. Hunt recognizes Lauda's discipline, his precision, his refusal to compromise. Even if he doesn't agree with it, he knows exactly how dangerous that mindset is. Lauda sees Hunt's instinct, his fearlessness, his ability to perform under pressure without overthinking. And even if he finds it reckless, he understands how powerful that kind of freedom can be. They don't admire each other in a conventional way, but they acknowledge each other, and that acknowledgement is everything. Because in a world like theirs, where the margins are razor thin, where one mistake can end everything, very few people truly understand what it takes to exist at that level. But they do. That shared understanding creates something unexpected, a kind of bond, not friendship, not loyalty, but something closer to brotherhood, a connection built not on affection, but on experience. Because no one else is pushing them like this. No one else is forcing them to evolve. No one else is revealing their limits so clearly. That's what rivalry becomes in Rush. Not just opposition, but transformation. Each man becomes better because the other exists, stronger, sharper, more complete, and that's why the relationship never feels one-dimensional. Even at their most competitive, there's something beneath the surface. A tension that isn't just about winning, but about proving something to themselves and to each other. And by the end, that rivalry doesn't disappear, it changes. Because once you face someone who understands you at that level, you can't go back to seeing them as just an opponent. They become something else, something permanent, something that defines a part of who you are. That's the quiet truth at the center of Rush. The greatest rival isn't just someone you try to defeat. It's the one person who forces you to become who you were meant to be. And once that happens, the line between rivalry and brotherhood almost disappears. What makes Rush truly come alive isn't just the story. It's the way that story is inhabited. because at the center of everything are two performances that don't just portray characters, they embody opposing forces. On one side, you have Chris Hemsworth as James Hunt. This is a role built on presence, confidence, charisma, physicality. Hemsworth leans into all of it. He doesn't hold back. Hunt walks into every scene like he owns it, loud, magnetic, unpredictable. There's an ease to the performance that mirrors the character's own approach to life. It feels effortless, almost instinctive, but that's exactly the point. Because Hunt is instinct, Hemsworth captures that surface brilliantly, the swagger, the recklessness, the charm that makes people gravitate toward him even when they shouldn't. You understand why he's compelling. You understand why he's dangerous. But the performance also sits right on the edge of familiarity. At times, it leans into the archetype, the charismatic playboy, the larger-than-life figure we've seen before. And because of that, there are moments where you're watching a version of Hunt rather than fully discovering him. And then there's the other side, Daniel Brühl as Niki Lauda, where Hemsworth's performance expands outward, Brühl's pulls inward. It's controlled, precise, almost uncomfortable at times. He builds Lauda not through grand gestures but through detail, the way he speaks, the way he looks at people, the slight pauses, the tension in his expressions, the feeling that everything is being processed, calculated, filtered. It's not immediately likable, and that's what makes it powerful, because Lauda isn't trying to be liked, he's trying to be right. Brühl understands that completely. He strips away the need for charm and replaces it with something more complex, intelligence, rigidity, vulnerability hidden beneath discipline. And as the film progresses, especially after the crash, that performance deepens even further. Pain enters the character, fear enters the character, and suddenly that rigid exterior starts to crack just enough to reveal what's underneath. That's where the performance becomes unforgettable, because it evolves. And when you place these two performances side by side, something interesting happens. They don't compete, they contrast. Hemsworth dominates space, Brühl controls it. One draws you in with energy, the other holds you there with intensity, and that balance is what makes the film work, because without one, the other doesn't land the same way. Hunt needs Lauda's restraint to feel chaotic. Lauda needs Hunt's chaos to feel controlled. Their performances are in constant dialogue with each other, reacting, adjusting, defining one another in every shared moment. And while one may feel more layered, more technically precise, the film doesn't work without both. Because this isn't about choosing who gives the better performance. It's about understanding how both performances complete the story. One gives you the surface, the other gives you the depth, and together they give Rush its heartbeat. It's easy to look at Rush and see it as a two-man story, two rivals, two perspectives, two forces colliding. But if you look a little closer, you realize something important. Those two men don't exist in isolation. They're surrounded by people who reflect them, challenge them, and sometimes quietly reveal who they really are. Because the supporting cast in Rush isn't there to take the spotlight, they're there to shape it, take the relationships first. Around James Hunt, everything feels fast, impulsive, and unstable. His connection with Susie Miller isn't built on patience or understanding. It's built on attraction, on immediacy, on the same instinct that defines how he races. It happens quickly, burns intensely, and begins to unravel just as fast. And that's not accidental. That relationship mirrors Hunt himself, spontaneous, passionate, but ultimately fragile. It shows you that the same qualities that make him exciting also make him unsustainable. Now shift to Niki Lauda. His relationship with Marlene Naus moves at a completely different pace. It's quieter, more grounded, built on stability rather than impulse. There's a sense of intention behind it, a reflection of Lauda's need for control, for structure, for certainty. But even here, there's distance, because Lauda doesn't open up easily. He doesn't express himself in the same way. His emotional restraint, which makes him so effective on the track, carries over into his personal life. And you can feel that tension, the gap between connection and control. That's what makes these relationships matter. They're not side stories, they're extensions of character. They show you how these men live when they're not racing, and in doing so, they deepen your understanding of how they do race. And then there's the broader supporting world. Teammates, engineers, media, rivals in the background. They don't dominate scenes, but they add context. They remind you that this isn't just a personal battle, it's happening inside a larger system. A sport driven by pressure, expectation, politics, and spectacle. You see how the environment feeds into the rivalry, how decisions aren't made in isolation, how every choice echoes beyond the individual. Even small moments, brief interactions, passing comments, reactions from those around them, help reinforce the stakes. They ground the story, they make the world feel real, and that's the key. The supporting cast in Rush isn't there to compete with the leads. They're there to complete the picture, to show that behind every rivalry, there's a network of relationships shaping it. influencing it, reflecting it. Because in the end, Hunt and Lara aren't just defined by each other. They're defined by how they connect or fail to connect with everyone around them. And it's in those connections that you start to see the full cost of who they are. There's a moment when you step back from Rush where a question starts to surface, not about the races, not about the rivalry, but about the people at the center of it. How well do we actually know them? Because while the film is undeniably engaging, visually sharp, and emotionally effective, there's a criticism that keeps returning. The characters, especially one of them, sometimes feel just out of reach. Let's start with James Hunt. On the surface, he's incredibly clear, charismatic, reckless, a thrill seeker, a man who lives fast and refuses to look back. The film shows you who he is almost immediately, and to its credit, it shows it confidently. You understand his energy, you understand his appeal, you understand why he's dangerous, but here's the problem. You understand him quickly, and then the film rarely pushes beyond that. Hunt is defined by instinct, by impulse, by a kind of raw emotional drive, but the deeper layers of that identity are only lightly explored. You see the behavior, but not always the foundation beneath it. You see what he does, but not fully why he does it. And because of that, there are moments where he starts to feel familiar. Not false, but familiar, like a version of a character you've seen before. The charismatic rebel, the reckless genius. The man who lives without limits. It works, it's entertaining, but it doesn't always evolve. Now compare that to Niki Lauda. Lauda's character feels more layered, not because he's given more screen time, but because the film allows you to sit with him differently. His personality unfolds in smaller, more controlled ways. You see his discomfort, his rigidity, his internal conflict. And after the crash, you're forced even deeper into his experience, his pain, his fear, his determination. There's progression, there's transformation. With Hunt, that evolution feels less defined. That's where the imbalance begins to show. And it raises an interesting question. Is that a flaw in the writing, or is it a reflection of the character itself? Because you could argue that Hunt isn't meant to be deeply analytical. He isn't someone who dissects himself. He doesn't live in introspection, he lives in action. So perhaps the film mirrors that. Perhaps it keeps him on the surface because that's where he chooses to exist. But even then, something feels slightly incomplete, because great character studies don't just show behavior. They reveal depth beneath behavior. And with Hunt, you occasionally feel like you're circling that depth without fully reaching it. It doesn't ruin the film, not even close, but it does create a subtle imbalance in how the two central figures are experienced. One feels gradually uncovered, the other feels immediately understood, but not always deeply explored. And maybe that's part of why the rivalry works the way it does. Because Lauda becomes the character you analyze, while Hunt becomes the character you react to. One invites you inward, the other pulls you outward. Both are effective, but only one feels fully excavated. And that's the quiet limitation at the heart of Rush, a film that gets remarkably close to complete character exploration, but leaves one of its most compelling figures just slightly beneath the surface. There's a moment in Rush where everything changes, not gradually, not subtly, instantly. Up until that point, the film moves like a competition, a rivalry building through speed, ambition, ego, two men pushing each other toward the edge. And then the edge arrives, the crash. What happens to Niki Lauda isn't just a plot point, it's a rupture, a moment that tears the film out of the rhythm it's been building and forces it into something far more real. Because suddenly this isn't about winning anymore, it's about survival. The spectacle disappears, the glamour fades, the thrill that once defined the sport is replaced by something uncomfortable, almost unbearable. Fire, injury, silence. The reality of what these drivers risk every time they get into a car becomes impossible to ignore, and the film doesn't soften it. It doesn't look away. It forces you to sit in it. Those hospital scenes, they don't feel like part of a racing movie. They feel like something else entirely. Slower, heavier, more intimate. You're no longer watching a rivalry. You're watching a man confront the consequences of everything he believed in. That's the turning point, because from here on, the story isn't the same. Lauda isn't the same, and neither is the film. Before the crash, James Hunt and Lauda are defined by what they want to prove. After it, they're defined by what they're willing to endure. And Lauda's response to that moment is what transforms everything. He doesn't walk away, he doesn't retreat, he returns. Not in some exaggerated, heroic way, but in a way that feels almost unsettling in its determination. The pain is still there, the fear is still there, the damage is permanent, and yet he goes back. Why? That's the question the film quietly asks. What kind of mindset allows someone to step back into the very thing that nearly killed them? It's no longer about ambition, it's something deeper, identity, purpose. A refusal to be defined by what happened, and that decision shifts the emotional center of the story. The rivalry doesn't disappear, but it evolves. because now it's not just about who is better, it's about what each man represents. Hunt continues to chase the feeling, the thrill, the instinct, the rush. Lara returns with something else entirely: awareness. He knows the cost now. He's felt it, lived it, and that changes the way you watch him. Every decision carries weight. Every moment on the track feels heavier, more deliberate, more dangerous. The film becomes quieter but more intense, because now the stakes aren't abstract, they're personal. That's what makes this moment so powerful. It doesn't just raise the tension, it redefines it. The crash isn't the climax of the film, it's the transformation, the point where Rush stops being just a story about rivalry and becomes a story about resilience. About confronting fear, about choosing to continue even when the cost is no longer theoretical. And once that shift happens, everything that follows carries a different meaning. Because now, every race isn't just about crossing the finish line. It's about what it takes just to be there at all. What makes Rush hit harder than expected isn't the speed, it's the emotion beneath it. Because for all its engines, its races, its spectacle, this isn't a film that relies on adrenaline alone. It builds something deeper, something that lingers, human drama. From the very beginning, the film positions you inside the lives of James Hunt and Niki Lauda, not as distant figures, but as people constantly under pressure, externally and internally. What they're dealing with isn't just competition, it's identity, expectation, fear, and the emotional intensity comes from how those pressures collide, because this isn't a story where tension only exists on the track. In fact, some of the most powerful moments happen when the cars are completely still, in conversations, in silence, in the space between decisions. You start to feel what drives them, not just what they do, but what it costs them. Hunt's life, for example, looks vibrant from the outside: freedom, success, attention. But underneath that energy, there's instability, a kind of restlessness that never settles. You begin to sense that the same intensity that fuels him also drains him. Lauda's journey moves in the opposite direction: controlled, structured, focused, but that control isolates him. It creates distance, not just from others, but from himself. His emotional world is tightly managed, almost suppressed. And when that control is broken, when reality forces its way in, the emotional impact is immediate and overwhelming. That's where the film finds its power: in contrast, in collision, in the moments where these carefully constructed identities start to crack. The crash is one of those moments, but it's not the only one. It's simply the most visible. What really sustains the emotional intensity is everything surrounding it: the buildup, the aftermath, the quiet realizations that follow. Because the film doesn't just show you pain, it shows you what people do with it. It shows you how they process it, ignore it, push through it, or let it reshape them. And that's where the drama becomes deeply human. There are no exaggerated speeches forcing emotion onto the audience. No artificial attempts to manufacture feeling. Instead, the film relies on restraint, on performance, on moments that feel lived in rather than staged. A glance, a pause, a decision made without words. Those are the moments that stay with you because they feel real. And that realism is what makes the emotional intensity so effective. It doesn't shout. It builds, slowly, steadily, until you realize you're no longer just watching a rivalry unfold. You're feeling it. You're feeling the pressure of expectation, the weight of failure, the fear of losing everything, and the strange, almost irrational drive to keep going anyway. That's what Rush understands, that beneath every competition, beneath every victory and defeat, there's something far more personal at stake. Something that has nothing to do with trophies or titles, something internal. And by grounding its story in that emotional reality, the film transforms itself. It stops being just a sports drama and becomes a story about what it means to be human when everything you are is constantly being tested. When you think of a film like Rush, it's easy to assume one thing: the races are the main event, the speed, the overtakes, the spectacle. But what Rush does, very deliberately, is something different. It doesn't treat the racing sequences as the story. It treats them as expressions of the story. Every time James Hunt and Niki Lauda step onto the track, you're not just watching a competition unfold. You're watching character in motion. Because these races aren't just about position. They're about personality. Look at how Hunt drives: aggressive, instinctive, unpredictable. He pushes beyond limits, takes risks others wouldn't dare consider. And when you watch those sequences, you're not just seeing speed, you're seeing his mindset. His willingness to gamble everything for a moment of victory. Then watch Lauda: measured, calculated, controlled. Every move feels intentional. Every decision has logic behind it. He doesn't race to feel something, he races to execute something. And that precision comes through in every lap, every maneuver. The track becomes a mirror, a place where their philosophies stop being ideas and become action. And that's why the racing scenes feel different from traditional sports films. They're not there just to impress you. They're there to reveal something. Even the way they're used structurally reflects this. The film doesn't overload you with constant racing. It spaces these sequences out. It chooses its moments carefully. Each race arrives with purpose, with stakes that are emotional, not just competitive. You're not asking who's in first. You're asking, what does this moment mean for them? That's the shift. Because when the film cuts to a race, it's not escalating spectacle, it's escalating tension. It's taking everything that's been building between these two men and forcing it into a single, high-pressure environment. And then it lets it play out. The races become turning points, moments where something changes, momentum shifts. Confidence breaks, identity is challenged, and after the crash, everything evolves even further. Because now, every race carries weight in a completely different way. It's no longer just about winning or losing. It's about survival, about fear, about the decision to return to something that nearly destroyed you. So when you watch those later sequences, you're not just feeling excitement, you're feeling consequence. That's what makes the racing sequences in Rush so effective. They're not the destination, they're the language, the way the film communicates what these characters can't always say out loud. Every turn, every risk, every split-second decision, it all tells you something about who they are in that moment. And by the time you reach the final race, you realize something important. You're not watching it to see who wins. You're watching it to understand what it means for either of them to even be there at all. There's an interesting divide when people talk about Rush. Some describe it as intense, relentless, edge of your seat, and others, they walk away feeling something very different, like the rivalry never quite hits the level it promises. That tension between perceived intensity and actual emotional impact is one of the most fascinating things about the film. Because on paper, everything is there. Two elite competitors, a life-and-death sport. A season filled with dramatic turning points. It should feel explosive, and at times it does. When James Hunt and Niki Lauda collide on the track, there's speed, danger, unpredictability. The races are sharp, fast, immersive. The stakes are clear, you feel the pressure. But here's where the debate begins. Because intensity in storytelling isn't just about what happens, it's about how deeply you feel it. And for some viewers, the film's controlled approach, its polished direction, its structured pacing, creates a kind of distance. You're watching something intense without always feeling completely consumed by it. The rivalry is present. The danger is real, but the emotional urgency, that's where opinions split. Some see the restraint as strength. The film doesn't overdramatize. It doesn't rely on constant escalation. It allows moments to breathe. It trusts the audience to understand the stakes without forcing them. That subtlety creates a different kind of intensity, quieter, more internal, more psychological. But others see that same restraint as a limitation. Because a story like this, two men risking their lives, pushing each other to extremes, almost demands a rawness, a volatility, a sense that everything could spiral out of control at any moment. And Rush rarely lets itself fully lose control. It maintains composure, even when the characters don't. So the question becomes, should the rivalry feel explosive or controlled? Should it overwhelm you or engage you? Because Rush sits right in between. It delivers intensity in bursts, during races, during key turning points, during moments of crisis, but it doesn't sustain that intensity at a constant high. It rises and falls. It builds, then pulls back, and depending on what you expect, that can either feel perfectly balanced or slightly restrained. But here's the interesting part. The rivalry itself mirrors that exact tension. Hunt is chaos, pure intensity, always pushing, always emotional. Lauda is control, measured, calculated, contained, and the film reflects both. It gives you flashes of Hunt's energy, but it frames them through Lauda's discipline. So what you're really experiencing isn't a lack of intensity, it's a filtered intensity shaped by perspective, and that's why the debate exists, because some viewers want to feel the chaos. While the film often chooses to present the control, in the end, Rush doesn't aim to overwhelm you. It aims to make you understand, and whether that feels thrilling or slightly held back depends on what you believe intensity should look like. There's a reason Rush feels fast, even when it isn't. It's not just the cars, it's the way the film is constructed, because what you're watching isn't just racing captured on camera, it's racing translated into cinematic language. And that language is built through cinematography, editing, perspective, and time itself. Look at how the film positions you. It doesn't keep you at a safe distance. It doesn't frame the races like an observer standing on the sidelines. Instead, it pulls you into the machine, into the cockpit, into the split-second decisions that define everything. You're not watching James Hunt and Niki Lauda from afar. You're sitting where they sit, seeing what they see, feeling the limitations of that perspective. That's where POV becomes powerful, because when the camera locks you into that viewpoint, everything changes. The track isn't just a space, it becomes a tunnel. A narrowing field of vision where reaction time is everything and hesitation doesn't exist. You don't just understand the speed, you experience its pressure. And then there's the editing, sharp, rapid, purposeful. Cuts aren't just used to maintain pace, they're used to create urgency. The film jumps between angles, between perspectives, between fragments of motion, forcing your brain to assemble the action in real time. It's not smooth. It's controlled chaos, and that's exactly what it needs to be, because racing isn't clean, it's unpredictable, violent, fragmented. The editing reflects that, but what makes it even more interesting is how the film plays with time. Slow motion isn't used randomly, it's used strategically. In moments where everything should feel overwhelming, the film suddenly stretches time. It isolates details, a glance, a mechanical movement, a shift in control. It pulls you out of the rush for just a second, so you can see what's really happening inside it. It turns fractions of a second into something visible, something understandable. And that contrast between speed and stillness is what gives the film its rhythm. Fast, chaotic sequences pull you forward, then slow motion pulls you inward, outward movement, inward focus, again and again. That balance is what makes the visual experience feel immersive rather than exhausting, and it all comes together in how the races are staged. The camera doesn't just follow the cars, it moves with them. It feels embedded in the action, almost like another participant rather than an observer. There's a physicality to it, a sense that the lens itself is reacting to what's happening. That's why the racing sequences feel alive. Not just exciting but immediate, not just fast but intense, because you're not being shown what racing looks like, you're being shown what it feels like, and that's the difference. Anyone can film speed, but Rush captures perception. It captures the way time bends under pressure, the way vision narrows, the way decisions happen faster than thought, and by doing that, it turns cinematography and editing into something more than technical tools. It turns them into the closest thing the film has to putting you behind the wheel. Close your eyes for a second and think about Rush. What do you hear? Not the dialogue, not the music, the engines. That's the first clue to how this film builds its world, through sound that doesn't just support the story but drives it. Because in Rush, the most powerful voice isn't human, it's mechanical. Every time James Hunt and Niki Lauda step into their cars, the film shifts, the soundscape tightens. The roar of the engine takes over, not as background noise but as the dominant force in the scene. It's loud, it's aggressive, it's overwhelming, and it's intentional. Because that sound does something dialogue can't. It places you inside the experience. You don't just hear the engine, you feel its weight, its vibration, its pressure. It drowns out everything else just like it would in reality. Conversations disappear, thought disappears. All that's left is instinct, reaction, survival. That's how the film uses sound to translate the psychological state of its characters. When the engine takes over, so does the moment. There's no room for distraction, only decision. And then there's the music. Hans Zimmer doesn't try to compete with that. He works around it. Instead of dominating the film, the score slips in and out, supporting, reinforcing, amplifying. It captures the tension of the races, the atmosphere of the 1970s, the emotional undercurrents that sit beneath the surface. But it never overwhelms the sound of the machines, and that restraint is crucial, because if the music took control, the film would lose something essential: the rawness, the authenticity, the sense that what you're hearing is real, immediate, unfiltered. Zimmer's score understands that the engines are the true heartbeat of the film, so rather than replacing that rhythm, it complements it. It fills the spaces where the roar fades. It adds emotional texture without breaking immersion. And when the two do come together, engine and score, you feel it, not as separate elements, but as a single experience. Sound becomes emotion, emotion becomes tension, tension becomes momentum. That's the brilliance of it. Because in most films, music tells you how to feel. In Rush, the sound tells you what it feels like. The chaos, the pressure, the intensity of being inside something you can't fully control. And when the engines go silent, when everything suddenly drops away, that absence becomes just as powerful, because now you're left with something else: breath, stillness, reality. The contrast hits harder because of everything that came before. That's how carefully the sound design is built. It's not just about volume or impact. It's about control, knowing when to overwhelm you and when to leave you with nothing. And in that balance, Rush finds one of its most immersive tools. Because long after the visuals fade, what stays with you is the sound of the race still echoing in your head. There's something about Rush that doesn't just show you the 1970s, it drops you into it, not as a backdrop. Not as decoration, but as a fully lived-in world. Because the film doesn't treat its setting like a historical label, it treats it like an atmosphere. You feel it in the colors first, that slightly muted, grainy texture. The warmth of the palette, the way everything looks just a little imperfect, less polished, more tactile. It doesn't feel like a modern film trying to recreate the past. It feels like something pulled from the past. And that's where the production design becomes so important. Every detail, costumes, cars, garages, interiors, works together to build a sense of time that feels authentic rather than staged. The clothes don't look like costumes. The hairstyles don't feel exaggerated. The environments aren't overly stylized. They're believable. They're lived in. And that matters because the world of 1970s Formula One wasn't just different in appearance. It was different in attitude. This was a time where danger wasn't minimized, it was accepted, where safety felt secondary, where the line between control and catastrophe was thinner than it should have been, and the design of the film reflects that. The cars themselves look raw, mechanical, almost fragile in their construction. They don't feel like the engineered precision machines of today. They feel like something that could fall apart under pressure, and that fragility adds tension. Because when James Hunt and Niki Lauda step into those cars, you don't just see the risk. You believe it. Even the smaller details reinforce this world. The sponsorships, cigarettes, alcohol, everywhere, openly displayed. The paddocks, the garages, the crowds, all carry a sense of looseness, of a sport that hasn't yet been tightened by modern regulation. It feels chaotic in a way that modern racing rarely does, and that chaos isn't exaggerated, it's contextual. It tells you what kind of world these men are operating in, what kind of environment shaped their decisions, their risks. Their identities, that's the key, because production design in Rush isn't just about accuracy, it's about immersion. It's about making sure that when the story unfolds, it doesn't feel like a recreation, it feels like a memory, something real. Something that existed before the camera arrived. And that authenticity does more than just enhance the visuals. It deepens the stakes, because when the world feels real, the danger feels real, the choices feel heavier, the consequences feel unavoidable, and suddenly, you're not watching a film set in the 1970s. You're experiencing a time where every race carried a risk that couldn't be controlled, only survived. There's always a tension in films like Rush, a quiet, constant negotiation between what really happened and what needs to happen for the story to work. Because the moment you base a film on real people, on real events, you're making a promise. Not just to entertain, but to represent something truthfully. And Rush walks that line carefully. On one side, it leans into authenticity. The rivalry between James Hunt and Niki Lauda, the structure of the 1976 season, the defining moments that shaped both men, these aren't invented. They're rooted in reality. The film captures the broad strokes of what happened, the emotional beats, the turning points that made this story so compelling in the first place. And that's why it feels real, because it is in essence. But then comes the other side, dramatic license, because reality, as powerful as it can be, doesn't always follow the rules of storytelling. It doesn't always build clean arcs, clear resolutions, or perfectly timed emotional climaxes. Film does, so Rush adjusts. It compresses events, it simplifies relationships, it sharpens certain conflicts and smooths others. It chooses which moments to emphasize and which to leave out entirely. Not to distort the story completely, but to shape it into something that flows, something that engages, something that feels cohesive on screen. And that's where the debate begins. How much is too much? At what point does shaping reality become changing it? Some viewers look at Rush and see a film that captures the spirit of the story, the rivalry, the danger, the personalities, and feel that's enough. That emotional truth matters more than factual precision. Others see the same choices and feel something is missing, details left out, events simplified, nuances flattened. They don't question whether the film is engaging. They question whether it's complete, and both perspectives are valid, because Rush isn't a documentary. It doesn't aim to present every fact, every detail, every perspective exactly as it happened. It aims to tell a story, one that reflects reality, but is still shaped by narrative needs. The question then becomes, what kind of truth matters more, the literal truth of events or the emotional truth of experience? Rush leans toward the latter. It wants you to feel what it was like to live through this rivalry, to understand the pressure, the danger, the obsession. It prioritizes impact over precision without completely abandoning the foundation of reality. And that balance is difficult. Too much accuracy and the story risks becoming fragmented or overly complex. Too much invention and it loses credibility. Rush exists somewhere in between, close enough to reality to feel authentic, refined enough to feel cinematic. And maybe that's the only way a story like this can work on screen, because the goal isn't to recreate history exactly as it happened. It's to translate it into something that can be experienced, something that can be felt. And in that translation, some details are inevitably reshaped. But if the core remains intact, if the essence of the rivalry, the risk, the human cost is still there, then what you're watching isn't a distortion of reality. It's an interpretation of it. and Rush understands that sometimes the most powerful way to tell a true story is not to repeat it exactly, but to make you feel why it mattered. To understand Rush, you have to understand the world it's set in, not just the cars, not just the races, the culture, because Formula One in the 1970s wasn't just dangerous, it was built on danger. This wasn't a sport trying to minimize risk, it was a sport that accepted it, almost casually. Drivers knew what they were getting into. Every time James Hunt or Niki Lauda stepped into their cars, there was an understanding that things could go wrong. Catastrophically wrong, and not in some distant, abstract way, in a very real, very immediate sense. Because back then, safety wasn't what it is today. The cars were raw, fragile, the tracks were unforgiving. The margins for error were almost non-existent. One miscalculation, one mechanical failure, one moment of bad luck, and that could be it. That was the reality. And the film doesn't exaggerate that. If anything, it just reveals it. You see it in the attitudes of the drivers, the way they talk, the way they prepare, the way they react when something goes wrong. There's an acceptance there, a kind of quiet understanding that this is the cost of competing at this level. You see it in the environment too, the sponsorships, the drinking, the looseness of everything surrounding the sport. It feels less regulated, less controlled, more chaotic, like a world still figuring itself out where rules exist, but boundaries are constantly being pushed. And that culture shapes everything. It shapes how these drivers think, how they approach risk, how they define success. Because when death is a real possibility, not just for you, but for the people around you, the meaning of winning changes. It becomes more urgent, more immediate, more personal. That's why the rivalry feels different in this context. It's not just about being better, it's about surviving long enough to prove it, and that adds a weight to every decision. Every race isn't just a competition, it's a calculation. How far are you willing to go? What are you willing to risk? And what happens when the cost becomes visible? That's where the culture of the 1970s becomes essential to the story. Because it explains why these men are the way they are, why Hunt embraces the danger, why Lauda tries to control it. They're not just reacting to each other, they're reacting to the world they're in, a world where fear is constant, where control is limited, where the line between life and death isn't theoretical, it's right there, every time the engine starts. And once you understand that, the film changes. The races feel heavier, the choices feel sharper. The rivalry feels more urgent, because now you're not just watching two men compete, you're watching two men exist in a world that demands everything from them and gives nothing back without a price. When you watch Rush, you're not just watching a rivalry unfold, you're watching a sport in transition, because Formula One in the 1970s wasn't what it is today. It wasn't refined, it wasn't controlled, it wasn't safe. It was raw, and that rawness is exactly what the film captures, while quietly showing how the sport was beginning to evolve. Look at the world surrounding James Hunt and Niki Lauda, drivers drinking before races. Cigarette and alcohol sponsorships everywhere, cars that look powerful but fragile. It feels almost reckless by modern standards, because back then it was. Safety wasn't the priority, performance was, winning was. And the culture reflected that mindset. But Rush doesn't just show you that era, it shows you the shift happening within it. Because as the story progresses, you begin to see cracks in that old way of thinking. Moments where the danger becomes too real to ignore, moments where the cost stops being acceptable, and that shift is embodied most clearly through Lauda. He represents something new. A driver who doesn't just accept risk but questions it, who studies the sport not just to win but to understand its limits, who looks at the environment and asks, does it have to be this way? That perspective marks a turning point. Because suddenly the sport isn't just about bravery, it's about awareness. It's about recognizing that pushing limits without control isn't strength, it's vulnerability. And even Hunt, in his own way, becomes part of that evolution. Because while he represents the old spirit, the freedom, the chaos, the thrill, his journey shows what happens when that approach meets reality. The sport changes them, and they change the sport. That's the key. Because evolution doesn't happen in isolation. It happens through moments, through events that force people to rethink what they believed was normal, through individuals who challenge the system simply by reacting differently to it. And Rush captures that tension beautifully. The old world still exists, loud, dangerous, intoxicating, but a new awareness is emerging beneath it, quieter, more calculated, more conscious of consequence. And by the end, you're left with a sense that you've witnessed more than just a championship battle. You've witnessed a turning point, a moment where Formula One began to shift from pure risk towards something more controlled, more structured, more survivable. And that's what makes the film feel larger than its story, because it's not just about who won in 1976. It's about how the sport itself was changing, and how the people inside it were forced to change with it. There's a moment at the end of Rush where the film quietly steps back. The race is over. The rivalry has reached its conclusion. The story, at least in cinematic terms, has done what it needed to do, and then something subtle happens. The film reminds you this wasn't just a story, it was real. Through the use of archival footage and closing context, Rush shifts your perspective in an instant. Up until that point, you've been immersed in performances, watching actors embody James Hunt and Niki Lauda, experiencing their rivalry through a carefully constructed narrative. But in those final moments, the film pulls back the curtain. You see the real people, the real races, the real aftermath, and suddenly everything you've just watched gains a different kind of weight. Because it's no longer just interpretation, it's connection. That's what makes this choice so effective. It doesn't just confirm authenticity, it reinforces impact. You're reminded that these weren't fictional arcs designed for emotional payoff. These were lives, decisions, consequences that extended far beyond the frame of the film. What happened after the season mattered, who these men became mattered, and the epilogue gives you that perspective. It tells you where they went, what they carried forward, what stayed with them. It transforms the ending from a resolution into a continuation, because real stories don't end cleanly. They move on, they evolve, they leave behind something unfinished. And by including that context, Rush acknowledges that. It doesn't try to contain the story within its runtime, it expands it. Even the footage itself plays a role beyond information. There's something powerful about seeing reality side by side with representation. The faces, the movements, the presence of the real Hunt and Lauda. It creates a bridge between what you've experienced as a film and what actually existed. It validates the portrayal, but more importantly, it deepens your understanding, because now you're not just thinking about the story, you're thinking about the people behind it, what they lived through, what they endured, what they became. And that shift is quiet but significant, because instead of ending on spectacle or emotion alone, the film ends on something more reflective, more grounded. It leaves you with context, with perspective, with the understanding that what you just witnessed wasn't just crafted drama, it was a glimpse into something that actually happened. And that's what makes the ending resonate. Not because it ties everything together perfectly, but because it reminds you that some stories don't belong to cinema, they belong to history. For a film that gets so much right, Rush has a flaw you start to notice the longer you sit with it. Not in the races, not in the performances, in the writing, more specifically in the dialogue. Because while the story itself is compelling, there are moments where the words don't quite carry the same weight as everything around them. And it's subtle at first, a line that feels a little too direct, a piece of exposition that explains more than it reveals, a conversation that sounds functional instead of lived in, nothing that breaks the film, but enough to create distance. Because great dialogue doesn't just tell you what a character is thinking, it lets you discover it. And in Rush, there are times where that discovery is replaced with clarity, almost too much clarity. The film occasionally spells things out when it doesn't need to. It explains motivations that are already visible. It reinforces emotions that are already felt. And in doing that, it loses a bit of subtlety. Take moments between James Hunt and Niki Lauda. Their rivalry is built on tension, on contrast, on everything they represent. And yet, sometimes their exchanges lean toward the obvious. Instead of letting silence, expression, or action carry meaning, the dialogue steps in to clarify it. It's efficient, but not always powerful, and that's the difference. Efficiency keeps the story moving, depth makes it linger. There are also moments where the dialogue feels slightly uneven in tone, where a line stands out not because it's memorable, but because it doesn't quite flow naturally within the scene. It feels written rather than spoken. And when that happens, even briefly, it pulls you out of the immersion. You become aware of the script instead of the moment. That said, it's important to recognize what the writing is trying to do. Rush is built to be accessible. It wants a wide audience to understand the story, the stakes, the characters, without confusion. And to achieve that, it leans into clarity. It avoids ambiguity. It keeps things moving. But that choice comes with a trade-off. Because in choosing clarity, the film occasionally sacrifices complexity. It chooses to explain instead of imply, to guide instead of trust. And that's where the writing feels slightly restrained, not weak in concept, but limited in expression. What makes this more noticeable is how strong everything else is. The performances are nuanced, the direction is controlled, the visuals are immersive, so when the dialogue doesn't match that level, it stands out. These aren't minor achievements. These are categories where films like this typically compete, and yet Rush didn't break through. So why? Part of it comes down to timing. It arrived in a year crowded with heavy contenders, films that leaned more into overt drama, more into traditional award narratives, stories that demanded attention in a louder, more immediate way. Rush, by contrast, is controlled. It doesn't push for awards. It doesn't present itself as prestige in the obvious sense. It just works quietly, effectively, without insisting on recognition. And sometimes that works against it. Because the Academy often responds to films that announce themselves. Big emotional peaks, clear thematic statements, performances that demand attention. Rush does all of those things, but in a more restrained way. It doesn't exaggerate. It doesn't overreach. And in a competitive year, that restraint can be mistaken for simplicity. There's also the genre factor. Sports dramas, especially racing films, don't always carry the same weight in awards conversations. They're often seen as technical showcases or crowd pleasers, rather than serious contenders for top honors. So even when a film like Rush elevates the genre, it still has to fight against that perception. And sometimes it doesn't win that fight, but here's the interesting part. The lack of awards hasn't diminished the film. If anything, it's sharpened its reputation. Because now, instead of being defined by trophies, Rush is defined by how it holds up over time. People revisit it, reevaluate it, ask again, why wasn't this recognized more? And that question keeps it alive, because awards validate a film in the moment, but conversation keeps it relevant long after. So maybe the real story isn't that Rush was ignored, it's that it didn't need the recognition to prove its value. It found its audience anyway, it earned its place anyway. And sometimes that kind of legacy lasts longer than any award ever could. Every genre has its benchmarks, the films that define it, the ones everything else gets compared to. And when it comes to racing movies, the list is surprisingly specific. You have Le Mans, a film built almost entirely around immersion, minimal dialogue, maximum realism. It puts you in the driver's seat and asks you to experience racing as it is, not as a story. Then there's Grand Prix, bigger, more technical, more visually ambitious. A film that treats racing like spectacle, pushing cinematography and editing to create something grand, almost operatic. And on the other end, you have films that lean more into drama, like Days of Thunder or Driven, where racing becomes a backdrop for character arcs, relationships, and emotional storytelling. So where does Rush sit? That's what makes it interesting, because it doesn't fully belong to any one category. It borrows elements from all of them, but reshapes the balance. Unlike Le Mans, Rush isn't trying to simulate racing as an experience. It doesn't dwell in long, uninterrupted sequences of driving. It doesn't prioritize realism above all else. And unlike Grand Prix, it's not trying to overwhelm you with scale. The visuals are strong, yes, but they serve the story, not the spectacle. Instead, Rush leans towards something more character-driven. But even there, it doesn't go as far into melodrama as some of the more conventional sports films. It doesn't turn racing into a simple emotional vehicle. It keeps the tension grounded in something more psychological. That's the key difference. Most racing films choose one direction: immersion, spectacle, drama. Rush tries to balance all three, and that balance is both its strength and its limitation. Because on one hand, it makes the film more accessible. It allows viewers who aren't racing fans to connect with the story. It creates a narrative that feels complete: action, emotion, character, all working together. But on the other hand, it means the film never fully commits to one extreme. It doesn't reach the pure immersion of Le Mans. It doesn't match the grand visual ambition of Grand Prix, and it doesn't dive as deeply into character psychology as some might expect. Instead, it sits in the middle, refined, balanced, controlled. And depending on what you're looking for, that can either feel like a perfect blend or a missed opportunity. But here's what Rush ultimately does better than most. It understands that racing by itself isn't always enough to carry a film. And drama by itself can feel disconnected from the sport, so it builds a bridge between the two. It uses racing to reveal character, and character to give meaning to racing. That's why, even among stronger or more iconic racing films, Rush holds its own, not because it redefines the genre, but because it reinterprets it. It finds a space between extremes and makes that space work. There's a reason the rivalry in Rush feels so immediate, even if you've never watched a single race, because it taps into something much bigger than Formula One. It taps into the idea of iconic rivalries. The kind that transcend the sport itself. Think about it. You don't need to be a boxing fan to understand the intensity of Muhammad Ali versus Joe Frazier. You don't need to follow tennis to feel the contrast between Bjorn Borg and John McEnroe. You don't need to study athletics to recognize the tension between Sebastian Coe and Steve Ovett. Why? Because those rivalries aren't just about competition, they're about contrast. Two individuals representing completely different philosophies, clashing at the highest possible level. That's exactly what Rush builds between James Hunt and Niki Lauda. Hunt is instinct, Lauda is calculation, Hunt is chaos. Lauda is control, and that dynamic is what places their rivalry alongside those iconic matchups. because great rivalries aren't defined by how many times competitors face each other. They're defined by what they represent. Ali versus Frazier wasn't just about boxing, it was personality, politics, identity. Borg versus McEnroe wasn't just about tennis, it was calm versus volatility, discipline versus rebellion. And in Rush, Hunt versus Lauda becomes something similar, a clash of worldviews, a question without a clear answer. Which path leads to greatness, the one driven by feeling or the one driven by control? That's what elevates the rivalry. Because it gives every race meaning beyond the result. It's not just about who finishes first, it's about which philosophy proves itself under pressure. And just like those legendary rivalries, the film understands something crucial. You don't need a villain, you need two equals. Two people strong enough to challenge each other and different enough to make that challenge meaningful. That's why you're never pushed to pick a side, because both are right and both are flawed. That balance is what makes rivalries endure, not dominance, not one-sided victories, but tension, respect, and the feeling that neither could exist in the same way without the other. That's what Rush captures. It takes a rivalry rooted in a specific sport, in a specific time, and connects it to something universal. The idea that greatness is often defined not by what you achieve alone, but by who stands opposite you when you do it. And once you recognize that, the film stops being about racing entirely. It becomes part of a much larger story, the story of what happens when two extraordinary people collide and neither is willing to back down. At the beginning of Rush, competition feels simple. Two men, one goal, win, beat the other driver, cross the line first, prove you're better. That's how it starts. But as the film unfolds, that idea begins to shift. Because Rush slowly reveals something uncomfortable. Winning isn't as clear as it looks. When James Hunt steps onto the track, victory feels immediate. It's about the moment, the adrenaline, the rush, the feeling of being alive. Winning for him is proof that he exists at the highest level, that he's faster, bolder, untouchable. But that feeling doesn't last, because once the race ends it fades, and he has to chase it again, and again, and again. Victory becomes temporary, almost addictive. Now look at Niki Lauda. For him, competition isn't about feeling, it's about control. Winning is calculated, measured, earned through discipline and precision. It's not about the moment, it's about mastery, but even that version of victory isn't complete. Because control has limits, and when those limits are exposed, when something happens that can't be calculated, can't be controlled, everything changes. That's where Rush deepens its question. What does it actually mean to win when the cost becomes real? Because at a certain point, competition stops being about the other person. It becomes about yourself, your limits, your fears, your identity. And that's when victory starts to transform. It's no longer just about finishing first. It's about what you're willing to sacrifice to get there. For Hunt, victory is about the experience, the thrill, the proof that he can live on the edge and survive it. For Lauda, victory becomes something else entirely. Perspective. There's a moment where the meaning of winning changes for him, not because he can't compete, but because he understands the cost more clearly than anyone else. He realizes that winning isn't worth everything, and that realization redefines the entire film. Because suddenly, competition isn't just about who is better, it's about what matters more, winning or living. And the film doesn't give you a simple answer. It doesn't say one man is right and the other is wrong, because both of them achieve something. Hunt wins the championship. Lauda wins something harder to define, control over what truly matters. And in that contrast, Rush delivers its most powerful idea. Victory is not universal, it's personal. It depends on who you are, what you value, what you're willing to lose. Because at the highest level, competition isn't just about beating someone else. It's about deciding what winning actually means to you, and whether, when everything is on the line, you're still willing to pay the price for it. Ambition sounds powerful, it sounds inspiring, driven, focused, necessary, but Rush shows you something most stories don't, what ambition takes, not what it gives. Because for James Hunt and Niki Lauda, ambition isn't just a goal. It's a force, something that shapes every decision, every relationship, every part of who they are. And the deeper you go into the film, the more you realize nothing about that comes for free. Look at Hunt. On the surface, ambition gives him everything: success, attention, a life filled with energy and excitement. He lives fast, wins big, and seems to have the freedom most people only imagine. But underneath that, there's instability. His relationships don't hold. His lifestyle becomes unsustainable. The same drive that pushes him forward also burns everything around him. Because when ambition is tied to constant intensity, nothing ever feels enough. There's always another race, another moment to chase, another high to reach, and that cycle doesn't stop. Now look at Lauda. His ambition is different, controlled, precise, disciplined, but the cost is still there. He sacrifices comfort, connection. ease, his life becomes structured around one purpose, perfection, and that kind of focus creates distance, emotional distance, personal distance, a life that works but doesn't always feel lived, and then the cost becomes visible. Not metaphorically, physically, the crash doesn't just change the story, it reveals the truth that's been there all along. That ambition at this level isn't just risky, it's dangerous. It demands everything, your body, your mind, your future. And even after that moment, even after the consequences are undeniable, Lauda returns. That's what makes it so powerful, because it forces a question you can't ignore. Why? Why go back? Why continue chasing something that has already taken so much? And the answer isn't simple. It's not about logic. It's not even about victory. It's about identity. Because for people like Hunt and Lauda, ambition isn't something they choose. It's something they are. To stop would mean losing a part of themselves, and that's the real cost. Not just what they lose externally, but what they risk losing internally if they walk away. That's what Rush understands. That ambition at its highest level isn't clean or inspiring in a simple way. It's complicated. It gives purpose. But it also takes balance. It creates greatness, but it demands sacrifice. And sometimes the line between those two things disappears completely, because in the end, the film isn't just showing you what these men achieve. It's showing you what it takes to become that person in the first place, and asking one final question. If ambition gives you everything you want, but takes everything else away, was it worth it? At first, a rivalry looks simple. Two people. One goal, win, but Rush quietly asks a deeper question. What if your rival isn't just someone you compete against, but someone who defines who you are? Because when you look at James Hunt and Niki Lauda, you're not just watching two drivers chasing a title. You're watching two identities being shaped in real time. Hunt on his own is chaos, energy, instinct, freedom, but it's only when Lauda enters his world that those qualities gain meaning. Because now that chaos has something to push against, something to challenge it, something that forces Hunt to prove that his way, his philosophy, actually works under pressure. Without Lauda, Hunt is just reckless. Now look at Lauda. On his own, he is control, precision, discipline, calculation, but without Hunt, that control exists in isolation. It isn't tested, it isn't threatened, it isn't forced to adapt. Hunt brings unpredictability into Lauda's world, and suddenly, perfection isn't enough. It has to compete. Without Hunt, Lauda is just methodical. That's the key. They don't just race each other, they reveal each other. Every time they meet on the track, something happens beneath the surface. They're not just trying to win, they're trying to validate who they are, to prove that their way of living, thinking, and competing is the one that deserves to succeed. And that's where identity begins to form, not in isolation, but in opposition, because identity isn't just about knowing yourself, it's about testing yourself, and in Rush, that test comes in the form of another person who refuses to back down. Another person who forces you to confront your limits, your weaknesses, your beliefs. That's why the rivalry evolves. What starts as competition becomes something more complex: recognition, respect, dependence, even though neither of them would ever admit it, because at a certain point the question stops being, can I beat him, and becomes, who am I without him? That's the moment the film shifts. Because now the rivalry isn't just external, it's internal. Each man begins to define himself not just by his own actions, but by how he stands in relation to the other. Their victories matter because of who they defeat. Their losses matter because of what they reveal. They become mirrors, distorted, opposing, but still reflections of each other. And by the end, something becomes clear. They didn't just compete for a championship. They shaped each other into who they became. That's the deeper truth Rush leaves you with. That sometimes, your greatest rival isn't just an obstacle. They're the reason you become who you are. Because without that challenge, without that constant pressure pushing back, you never fully discover your own limits or your own identity. And once that connection exists, it never really disappears. It becomes part of you, permanent, unavoidable, and impossible to replace.